Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. I can't believe Art Basel Miami Beach is already here. It signals the last major moment in the art world for 2025. After the very successful November auctions in New York, it'll be interesting to see if that momentum carries into Miami. I hope to see many of you there in person, and if you are attending, please let me know. In this week's episode of the podcast, we're joined by Beeple, the artist whose work has shaped the evolution of digital art and the wider NFT space. People will have a new work debuting at Art Basel Miami in the brand new 010 section, the fair's curated section dedicated to digital art. In our conversation, we discuss what it was like for him to experience the rapid rise of NFTs from the inside, how the digital art ecosystem has matured since that moment, and whether collectors and institutions are engaging with digital art in more thoughtful and sustainable ways. We also explore the significance of Art Basel committing to digital art through 010, the evolving role of galleries for artists working in this space, and more details about the new work people will be presenting in Miami. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Beeple, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, how we doing?
Doing well. I can't believe Basel Miami is just around the corner. It'll be here before we know it. And we appreciate you taking a little bit of time to chat with us, as you will have a work on view next week at the fair as a part of the 010 section, which is a new initiative, a curated section focused on digital art. And I'm excited to chat with you about that. But before we do so, I wanted to ask you a few questions just about your experiences in the NFT and digital market over the last few years. You were, of course, at the center of the NFT boom at a time when the market was still incredibly nascent and all of a sudden exploded into a kind of global hysteria and phenomenon. What was it like to experience that moment firsthand, both publicly and privately? And how do you look back on that period now?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is still very surreal to me, to be quite honest, because it's been it's been longer, it's been much longer now that people like hated NFTs. That it's hard to remember sometimes that there was a brief window when people didn't hate NFTs. And so yeah, and it was all just happening so fast. On so many different levels of, people that we were talking to and building out the studio here and building new works and sort of doing talks and interviews all over and sort of tons of travel and stuff. And so yeah, it's very surreal. But I think what's happened since obviously was inevitable. And I was the person, the next day after the big sale being like, guys, I hate to say it, I think this is a bubble, like, because I saw a lot of dumb shit. Sorry, maybe bleep that out. That
No, it's fine.
I saw a lot of dumb shit that it was just like, okay, either this stuff is going to zero or I am going to be a trillionaire. Like, there's no other way around it. Like, this stuff is so dumb. There's no way this will hold value. And it didn't hold value. And so I think you obviously saw, a big sort of like correction in the market. But I think what's happened now is there's much more of a focus, which I think is healthy, on things that have actual sort of innovation behind them, things that actually move the needle with people in terms of like an emotional response. And I think, again, this is going to be like any other sort of like medium of art. There will be a, honestly, probably pretty small handful of people who are at the sort of like, sort of vanguard of that, or the sort of like front of that, and there will be a massive amount of sort of like people sort of participating otherwise. I think with digital art in particular, because it is so accessible and because it has literally absolutely zero friction or cost to participate in it, at least on some level, I think I personally think over time it will become the sort of like biggest kind of like market and biggest sort of like avenue for, art in general. Just because again, any kid with an iPad, which is every kid or a phone, can make digital art. If you want to go paint a painting and be a painter, that's actually has a much higher sort of like barrier to kind of like entry or sort of like access to that. So I think just by pure virtue of that fact and the fact that it's easily sort of like shareable online, I think it will be a massive market over time, but I think it's going to be a slow sort of like grind up.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And as you were reflecting on that boom period in the NFT market, I was thinking back to my own reactions at the time, especially as someone coming from the traditional art world, years as an art advisor, and before that, at an auction house for several years. I remember feeling the same sense of euphoria and, quite frankly, shock at how quickly the market was accelerating. At the same time, I was also wondering, would there be more selectivity when it comes to quality of works? Would curators become involved in institutions? And would there be really interesting writing about the art? So I was always curious if these types of things would enter into that space. I'm curious from your perspective, since that peak period, how have you seen the space mature during this transition? Are collectors actually approaching the work in a more thoughtful way? And are institutions and curators engaging with the medium in ways that point to a more stable long-term ecosystem?
Yeah, I think yeah, it's definitely happening. I think you're seeing definitely on the sort of collector side, people, I mean, a bunch of people got burned to be quite honest, that they like invested in a bunch of stuff that um and I hate to say it, but a lot of them were truly investing in the stuff versus sort of collecting it as kind of like, sort of like patrons. And I could tell that too, because I had been making digital art for like 20 years before this happened. And so I knew a lot of people in the digital art scene. And so it was sort of like, okay, it seemed like a lot of people suddenly got very interested in this as soon as money was attached. And I was like, I don't know if you're actually that interested in digital art or just the financial aspect of it. Um, but I think you are starting to see, more museums and institutions and curators sort of like embrace this stuff. I have a piece at LACMA right now. I've had, a bunch of sort of like museum shows, this year in Tokyo, Nanjing, China, a show in London at South by Southwest, at the Shed in sort of like New York. And I think you're starting to see that there's a big show in Toledo now with a ton of different sort of like artists. Obviously, Rafiq's piece at the MoMA was a huge sort of like moment as well. And so I think you are starting to see, more and more sort of like acceptance of this medium. And I think that makes sense given that, and I think you'll see more and more of that as technology is so impactful on our lives. It seems bizarre to me that digital art would not be a massive part of that conversation. AI is going to drastically alter the sort of like course of humanity in the next, 20 years. Pick a number. It's not like it is or it isn't. It's just what that number is of how many years. And so digital art and the sort of like conversations that it's having around that and its ability to be part of that conversation in a way that, sort of other mediums can't do as sort of like readily, I think only makes sense. And so I think it's really just a matter of time. And I think it is still something where there's not honestly a ton of curators that know about it to like speak about it. And so that will change over time too, as more people are sort of like educated and more people go through, art school and sort of like have more sort of like training in this stuff. But yeah, I think you do see a lot of sort of maturing of the space. It's just going to take, a bit more time because I think it's such a radically different medium, and also it's changing really fast. And so it's not just like, okay, if you're like, I learned about art in, 15 years ago, digital art, and I know everything, about it. It's like, oh, kind of like the tools have changed. I mean, the tools have changed drastically in the last 2 years. And so that's not the case with other mediums. It's not like, whoa, now photography has all this crazy shit and painting has all these new paints that just got invented in the last 18 months. It's like you really have to like keep up with it. And so I think that makes it a challenge too. But again, it's such a massive part of society. I think, it will continue to sort of like grow.
Yeah. And so, as I mentioned in the introduction, 010 is a new curated section focused on digital art that'll be debuting at Art Basel Miami this year. And it's being framed by the fair as a major long term commitment to support art of the digital era and really connect it with the traditional art market. How did your involvement with 010 come about?
So actually Noah Horowitz, the CEO of Art Basel, has been out to the studio a couple times, and it was very sort of like evident that he wanted to really kind of like dive in more to the sort of like digital space, and then he was very curious about it, and it like clicked for him that there's something here, and that it isn't just pure sort of, kind of like speculation, and that there is a growing community of people who is very serious about this, and that it can sort of like hold its own critically against other sort of like medium as well. And so, he partnered with sort of like Eli and other people in the space here to help sort of like bring this together and bring it together in a way that I think feels really authentic to the space, feels really sort of like grounded in what we're trying to like build here. So I was very excited when they reached out to sort of like show some work at the space because or show some work at sort of like Basel, because I think to me it's exciting, in our space in particular. It's such a like online sort of like echo chamber of like very coded sort of like knowledge. And to me, I think it's always fun to be able to sort of like let the outside world peek into this, sort of like weird kind of sort of like corner of the internet that we inhabit. And so I'm excited to see how the reception is with a sort of like more general public, because I think that also is important in that it brings a higher level of sort of like criticality to it than, sometimes otherwise would kind of like happen. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and I think you spoke about this a bit, but for you and even for digital artists more broadly, how important is it to have a platform like Art Basel embrace and even contextualize digital art? Do you see this as a kind of validation for the medium?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, to be quite honest, there's a lot of sort of back and forth in our space of like, should we even give a shit about being at Art Basel? We don't fucking need them. They need us, blah, blah, blah. And I don't see it as this like either or thing. I see it as just being like another kind of like outlet. It doesn't like take away from anything that happens online or happens in these other space. It's just like another sort of like additive thing. And I think, again, I think the conversations that we're having in digital art and the conversations that digital art as a medium can have around these very impactful sort of like things that are happening in society with regards to technology's effect on culture, on effect on, every sort of like aspect of society and life. Um, I think I would love to see things like this that do expose people that would otherwise never sort of like see it. And so to me, I think it's really exciting, and I think it's a good thing.
And one other aspect about Art Basel Miami that I wanted to ask you about is the fact that if we think about the thousands of artworks that'll be on view in the convention center in Miami, nearly all of it will be for sale by galleries, not by artists directly. But at 010, that isn't entirely the case. For example, you're showing your own work and it's for sale by your studio. That's a little bit of a foreign concept, I think, for many of our listeners, for example, who come from the traditional art world. And in nearly every case, an artwork is for sale by an artist gallery, not by the artist themselves. What do you think about the gallery system for digital artists? Do you think it's vital, or how do you think about the role a gallery plays in a digital artist practice and career?
I think it really depends on the artist. And I think this is another issue where it's kind of and not sort of like or. I think galleries, on the traditional side, there hasn't been a ton that have kind of embraced digital art sort of like full, given their full sort of like weight and kind of like sort of like force behind it. You haven't seen, Gagosian or Pace or sort of Hauserworth or any of these sort of like do that in a really sort of like meaningful way. And so I think a bunch of digital galleries and most of the people showing in 010 are digital sort of like galleries. I think you will see those sort of like spring up to kind of fulfill that, because I think, to be honest, there is a lot of artists who still don't really want to do the things that a gallery does. Like, I'm a bit more of an anomaly in that I was doing sort of like freelance for 20 years and I never had a team. And so I was managing all the like contracts and, if somebody came to me and was, here's the budget for the thing. Okay, this is the budget and all that stuff. And so we have a team here too. My brother handles, a massive amount of sort of the like day-to-day stuff and all this logistics around it as well. And so I think it's something where even in the digital space, you'll continue to sort of like see galleries because they provide a service that a lot of artists just don't want to deal with. And so, yeah, I don't think it's really, again, sort of like an either or, but I think because of sort of like, the sort of like tools available now in terms of like sort of like promotion and social media and being able to sort of like reach audiences directly, I think you will see another path, which is the path that I sort of like came up with, in that I wasn't nor necessarily validated by a few sort of like key tastemakers or a certain gallery or this or that. I was more validated by the millions of followers that I have online, and they sort of like convinced some other people that this sort of like work has value. And so I think it's a slightly different path, but I think it's one you'll probably see more people kind of like go through in the future, but not all people. I think galleries are not going anywhere, and I think they still serve a very sort of like vital role for many artists.
And so before we let you go, you will, of course, have a work that's available for sale at Art Basel Miami this year. That's a part of the 010 curated section. Can you give us a little bit of a sneak preview as to what the work will be?
So the work that we're showing is a series of robot dogs that have different personalities to them. And so they kind of, it looks like a robot dog, but with the head of like Andy Warhol or the head of Elon Musk. And these dogs autonomously sort of like move around in this kind of like pin that we've built. And so they're also taking pictures of the fair and then kind of like reinterpreting those pictures in real time according to the sort of like personality of each dog. So the Warhol dog is taking pictures and and then through AI, it sort of like makes it look like a Warhol sort of like artwork. And then they all have printers on them as well. So then they poop out like prints right there. And so these prints are like all over the ground in the like pin or whatever. And then some of the prints also have like an NFT attached. And so the work that we're selling is the dogs themselves as these sculptures that produce other work. And then there's a bunch of sort of like these little sort of like prints and some NFTs that will just be given out free to people who are, at the fair. And so yeah, kind of a different thing. Uh, and so it will be very interesting to see people's reaction to this.
Well, it definitely sounds like a can't miss work at the fair this year. Beeple, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and reflecting a bit about the NFT market and space over the last several years, as well as discussing some of your thoughts about being included in this inaugural edition of 010 at Art Basel Miami. Looking forward to seeing you next week.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.